Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we will talk about a copy of a drawing that I obtained from the archives more than a decade ago, I suppose. Quite a lot more than a decade. Anyway, Ole found it in my office and found it interesting, so here I am talking about it. It is a drawing of the Charles Galley. Charles Galley was built in 1676, and I will talk briefly about the ship because it is one of the most interesting vessels to emerge in the later 17th century. The drawing specifically, this one is almost certainly a early 19th century copy of an earlier drawing that does not appear to have survived. It is held in the drawings collection of the National Maritime Museum, currently known as the Royal Maritime Museum in Greenwich. And of course it can be found and ordered online from the site. I'm not sure whether they still are sending actual paper copies. They may be digital nowadays. I have not ordered lately drawings. This one took for bloody ever and a day for them to move and actually get it to me. I think 2-3 months, something like this. But normally they work much faster than this. Something had just goofed off in the system. It is a very interesting model for a number, or rather it produced a very interesting model for a number of reasons. I don't know how much is visible here under my right hand, where the lines, where the sections of the ship are actually drawn. You will see that she is fairly shallow compared to her length. She also is not particularly heavily armed, but she has an entire deck of small oar ports under it. So, I will put this drawing to the side a little bit and let's talk a little about this ship and why is it interesting. In the later 17th century, after the end of the Third Anglo-Dutch Wars, the Royal Navy was engaged in series of engagements and series of wars actually against the so-called Barbary pirates. Of course, they did not consider themselves pirates at all. They considered themselves jihadists, and it was probably a better way to describe them is as privateers. Nominally, the North African principalities, Tripoli, Algiers, etc., were subject to the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople, but by the later 17th century, the process in which this dependency on the Sultan was getting more and more theoretical than practical was already well underway. They, of course, would remain a major challenge to European shipping in the Mediterranean for quite a while. And once the Anglo-Dutch Wars were over, the Restoration Navy had to concentrate on securing the trade networks, the trade routes in the Mediterranean against the attacks of these raiders. This was done in a number of ways. First of all, of course, the provision of convoy duty for the merchant ships. And the second was by actually deploying squadrons for active warfare against the privateers. Most of the ports were practically impregnable for the European technology at the time. It would not be until the 1830s that France will finally put an end to the Algerian piracy on the high seas. There are two things that the pirates were after. Of course, the cargoes also, but really the main focus was slaves, European slaves. In 1827-28, for example, roster of people living in Algiers pointed out that for about 100,000 native population of Algiers, there were more than 100,000 European slaves there. Especially in the first half of the 17th century, the Barbary principalities made a real nuisance of themselves. By the later 17th century, two things had become quite clear. First of all, it was very hard to operate in the Mediterranean because there were no secure bases. The English were hoping, and since this is before 1707, it is the English rather than the British. The English believed that Tangier in Morocco, which was part of the dowry of Catherine of Braganza, the wife of King Charles II, is going to be an excellent base from which to operate in the Mediterranean. It proved to be anything but an excellent base. 20 years later, finally, King Charles II drew the line and abandoned this outpost, which had never, ever lived up to its promise, no matter what Sir Julian Corbett may be saying on the subject. As part of this endeavor, the second thing that became obvious is that the pirates always have cleaner ships than the Royal Navy. Therefore, they're always going to be faster. So you had to intercept them as close to their home ports as is humanly possible. Or, alternatively, you had to force them to attack unknowingly superior force. And finally, you had to come up with faster but powerful cruisers that can deal with the situation. And that is the context in which the Royal Navy experimented with two initially, subsequently a third ship was built to the same specification. The first one, and the larger of the two, was the Charles Galley. Allegedly, it was mostly the brainchild of King Charles II himself. He was probably one of the most competent and interesting monarchs, very knowledgeable of naval affairs, extremely knowledgeable of ship construction, ship handling. He himself was a very good yachtsman after all, and he steered his own boats. The point is that he attempted, the first experiment was by purchasing an actual galley to operate against the Barbary pirates. Very quickly it became clear that she is grossly expensive to operate, and quite frankly that the English do not have the competence to operate galleys in the Mediterranean the way the Mediterranean powers do. At the same time, in the light and fickle winds, there was necessity for a ship with higher maneuverability than the average fourth rate that was used in the wars and the fifth rates. So that is when Charles said, well, all right, why don't we create a compromise vessel, a sailing ship that will have a full bank of oars on the lower deck. These oars will have to be under the deck so that they are protected from the small fire of the Berber corsairs, and the ship will retain its ability to maneuver. This way, under oar and under sail, we should combine the best of both worlds. How successful was this is a different story. In reality, they proved to be very fast sailors. They were not so fast under oars as the king had hoped. The third and final group of the vessel of the group was the Mary Galley, built in 1688, if only too fallible memory is serving me right. There is a contract for the construction of the Mary Galley surviving in the National Archives of Great Britain, and as a matter of fact, I believe I have a copy of it somewhere in my own archives. So if I were to build a model of the Charles Galley, and other greater minds have built models of this ship before me, I probably would combine the contract for the construction of the Mary Galley together with the Charles, and that should produce as accurate as is humanly possible vessel. The ships had fairly long and extensive and very, very active careers. Some of the logbooks of the Charles Galley survive, especially from her initial cruising in the Mediterranean. Again, I have copies of them. They're very interesting reading. And a whole class of ships was derived from this. Most of the other ships, however, were built by private yards, specifically for privateering or for trades that required fast sailing. The galleys were lower built than traditional vessels. They did not have poop decks, they only had quarter decks. They were quite low, they were fairly shallow. As I said, they were built specifically for speed. Probably the most famous of this group would be the Adventure Galley, commanded by no less known person than Captain William Kidd, once pirate hunter, eventually turned pirate himself, allegedly. So with this, ladies and gentlemen, I bring this video to a conclusion. This would make a very interesting model, although there are other models built. There is a miniature model of the Charles Galley. There is a regular, at least one 1:48 model built in the 60s, 70s, I think it was, that was published in the old, now defunct British ship modeling magazine. But there aren't that many. And yet the vessel is very interesting. Her decoration is limited and therefore quite manageable. The carvings are quite manageable. There are a number of Willem van de Velde drawings, sketches, and portraits of the ship throughout, dating from the 70s and through 70s through 90s, when the ship was most active. So by all means, this would make a so much more interesting model than yet another victory got between us and evil. With this, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a most wonderful rest of the day. Thank you ever so much to everybody. Thank you particularly to the sponsors of this channel. Without you, I would not continue, quite frankly. Thank you so much, and till next time.